I'm really looking forward to this next discussion. 4 experts are going to share their insights on topics including expected reforms to payment regulation, associated risks and legal implications, implementation considerations for banks, interaction with new digital developments in our payments panel. But I am excited because, as I mentioned earlier, last week in the US was Crypto Week. And I know for any crypto bros in the room, every week is Crypto Week, but last week was a special Crypto Week. Andrew Irvine spoke about this morning, and that there's possibly more of a focus on this in some overseas jurisdictions than there is in Australia. I looked at Andrew on the stage and I thought, I know a fellow crypto bro when I see one. It's great to see him get out of the hoodie, out of the house, and interact with the community a little bit, as us crypto bros don't do all that much, because it's very exciting. What happened in the United States, you might notice, they've just passed the Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for US Stablecoins Act, which, as far as acronyms go, Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for US Stablecoins Act becomes the Genius Act. Now, the community is split on whether this is an absolute radical, great breakthrough for alternative currencies, or whether it exposes us to Wild West sort of stuff and potential risk and all that sort of stuff. We have to agree regardless. It's one of the great acronyms in the history of legislation. Where I'm at, I'm absolutely loaded to the gills on Trump coins, and I am ready to rock. What's the future of payments? In particular, I want to hear the panel addressing that one. Come to the stage now, please. Partner at Norton Rose Fulbright, James Morris, is going to steer this discussion with Katrina Stewart, executive sponsor from Australian Payments Plus, Dianne Shay, who's the head of payments industry for the National Australia Bank, and Bronwyn Yam, chief product officer at Cuscal. Please give them all a big round of applause.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. Look, I'm a big fan of the Genius Act. I'm looking forward to the explanatory memorandum, though, because I think that'll help me understand it. I'm lucky to be joined by 3 people who are absolute geniuses in the payments industry. Bronwyn down the end, Dianne in the middle, and Katrina next to me. So very pleased to have you here. I think we've heard a lot already about the increase in regulation generally in the financial services industry. When we look at it in the payment system world, I think probably a better word is evolution. We're looking at a real evolution of the payment system, and something that we've really been focused on for the best part of 10 years in Australia. So where did we start? We saw the innovation of real-time payments with the new payments platform in 2018. We're seeing the demise of cash, currently sitting at about 13 to 14% usage in Australia, expected to drop down to 4% by about 2030. We're seeing what is my favourite term currently in the market, Czechsit. Australia needed a Brexit equivalent. I think Czechsit is a good one, with checks scheduled to end in 4 to 5 years. So seeing some real innovation there. And why are we seeing these changes? Well, they're really driven by, for the most part, consumers. They're looking at different ways to pay for things, and that's essentially breaking it down. What's that seeing in terms of innovation? We're seeing growth of products like digital wallets. We're seeing mobile payments platforms obviously take off and continue to be readily used, in addition to things like buy now, pay later offerings, obviously the subject of regulation at the moment, and the demise of the traditional credit card. So I'd be interested to throw it out to the panel, and always good to start with a generic question. What do you see as some of the most innovative changes, I guess, we're seeing in the market today? Dianne, maybe.
Okay, thanks. Aside from one of the biggest changes, this is an all-female panel in payments, go payments. I think the point that you made about customers, bringing customers closer into the innovations that take place in the ecosystem. Payments are 4 things, and so who woke up this morning and thought, "Great, I get to make a payment today." No one. Aside from us payment geeks, but in general, they're for some other purpose. And so the innovation over the last 10 years has largely been driven at the customer experience layer, because customers are asking for instant, seamless and secure payments. And so one of the things that we've seen is customers have more transparency, more control, more convenience and more security than they ever have before. And that's been supported by the enabling technologies, by device, API, the amount of data that can flow with a payment, and biometrics. And so if we look at that based on current customer adoption, payments past 2030 will predominantly be digitally native payments in Australia. And that means that we have to think about things slightly differently. And the enabling, one of the things that we have done has been the enabling frameworks that we've put around that adoption, the way that we think about payments as an ecosystem that values innovation and competition, and where the industry collaborates to achieve the necessary network effects and the productivity uplift that comes with that. And so that's allowed us as an industry to deliver industry-wide programs and drive adoption more efficiently, while ensuring that there's space for that competition and choice for the customer.
Bronwyn or Katrina?
So I think, Dianne touched on some really great points, but I think ultimately over the last 10 years, and you've mentioned it, is that there's a lot more players in the payment ecosystem to deliver some of these digital experiences. So everyone's kind of really thinking about the various ways in which they need to innovate. But I think part of the impact of those innovation that created some structural shift in the last decade is really about how we approach regulation in a balanced way, so that we're still fostering innovation, but making sure that we're creating the safe guardrails for the ecosystem to operate. And with that, then it's also thinking about the new additional risk, operational risk, because you've got now players in there that may not be traditionally a regulated entity, not necessarily banks. Payments is now being done in digital platforms, wallets that you've mentioned. So all of that adds to the structural shift that we've seen in the last decade.
And I think to echo to both Dianne and Bronwyn's points, I think it has been that fundamental shift towards digital payments. And I think that's very obvious from a kind of consumer perspective in terms of when people are making payments, increasingly it's digital wallets and those other kind of form factors. I think what we've also seen, and probably what's less apparent, is that kind of innovation and the transformation that's starting to happen to payments more broadly as well, by utilising the real-time payments infrastructure that we have. And so, started to see businesses and corporates adopt it as well, and also, governments as well. So during, COVID, we saw Services Australia use the MPP to send, relief payments out to people at scale over the weekend. And the fact that you can then deliver those funds to people's accounts, within kind of sort of seconds, has fundamentally, I think, changed the expectations of payments. And we're increasingly seeing that kind of translate more into the business sector as well, in terms of what now are the opportunities to actually reimagine and transform our business and corporate payments as well. And I think that's where there's a real opportunity for us as an industry to think about what that can mean, and how we can basically, sort of put that into train.
So maybe sticking with you, Katrina, for the next one. We often talk about innovation in terms of speed, improving the user experience. Looking more broadly than that, though, are there other types of innovation that perhaps we should be considering more, focusing on more, that are maybe missing some of the limelight in terms of how we refer to innovation?
So I think, kind of building on what I was saying before, I think one of the real areas where I think is ripe for innovation is around thinking about process re-engineering and efficiency sort of innovation that we can see, and how we can bring together, to Dianne's point about the payment part, to broader processes as well. So when we think about as an economy, how can we re-engineer some of our fundamental business processes? We have the government pushing us towards a more digital economy, thinking about things like e-invoicing. Where does payments come into that? Actually, you can bring the payments piece of that together with the e-invoicing process to have a reimagined procure-to-pay cycle, where you're using Pay2, for example. Businesses can pre-authorise those payments, those regular supply payments can go through. You're seeing automation benefits as well. And what that means both for businesses and also for the banking sector, I think, as well, in terms of actually the opportunities from a back office perspective and the efficiency improvements that can be made by utilising more modern payments infrastructure that carries more information with the payment, but also gives you that information in real time as well. So you're not having a delay of having to wait 2 days to know what's happened to that payment. And I think there's a real opportunity there for us to think about, what that means for the business and the wider Australian economy. And I think that's an area of innovation where we're going to start to see more and more happen. I think we're just starting to see the cusp of it. It's a little bit sort of coming out here and there. But when we think about, more broadly, what does that mean for the economy? When we think about, the tax office is thinking about tax 3.0 and how do you have real-time tax events? So you bring that together with the payment system and what that can mean. Payday super, where we can actually have superannuation payments go out at the same time that people get paid. And also, what that means for, individual citizens and for Australia, more broadly as well.
Sometimes we don't call it innovation either. We call it compliance. So if you think about something like advanced encryption standards, that is, so that's innovation at the security layer because it's about making payments more secure and more resistant to blunt force attacks. But we don't call that innovation because we all have to do it. So we just label it as compliance, but it's making payments more secure for the end user.
And confirmation of payee would be another good example of that in terms of, it made a lot of sense, for a market in terms of, when you make a payment, you can actually see who you're paying. But the banks maybe felt maybe that was a little bit more of a compliance effort. But it was such an important thing for us to do as an industry as we think about more broadly how to protect customers from fraud and scams.
So thinking about that whole protection element, I mean, one of the changes we have seen in payments is the multitude of participants now in a transaction. So, we've got an interesting question is really what is the role of banks? What is the role of platforms, aggregators, individual PSPs in ensuring not only the safety and reliability of individual transactions, but also the safety and resilience of the system as a whole? I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Bronwyn.
So I think we've talked a lot today about trust. So I kind of want to anchor back on trust, and I'll slice it in two different ways. With all of the various players that is now part of the ecosystem, we need to broaden our mindset to think about the industry like the banking industry and the banks. We talked about what the ATO is doing, what platforms are doing, what accounting software is doing. All of that is now becoming part of the ecosystem that they are playing a role in moving payments, because we're all aspiring to this embedded payments, invisible payments type experience. But with that, then it's firstly, we need to establish trust with each of the participants within the ecosystem. Because if we don't trust all of these players, it's very hard to collaborate on things that are important to collaborate as an industry, whether that's safety, whether that's resilience. Any of that is important for us to have that trust first. Through that, then we can build the right mechanics to be it share the right information, make sure that everyone is treating that information in the same standards in the right way, and then touching on Dianne's point about the whole cybersecurity and resilience of the system. Through that, then as a whole of ecosystem, we can then really build and continue to increase trust that Australian consumers and businesses have on all of the players that are now enabling one part or all parts of their payment needs. So all of those are the roles that I would expect everyone will need to have a right mindset to drive towards collaboration, knowing that there are certain areas within payments that is not necessarily for competition, but it is for collaboration, and we can still innovate together to continue to create a safe and trusted environment and ecosystem.
And I think to that point, it's been really important to establish where are the areas of collaboration, where that's really, really important from a broader ecosystem perspective, and where is the competitive space as well. And I think being kind of clear around that and people's different roles that they play.
So the collaboration element's very important. And I'd be interested in Dianne's thoughts in terms of whether, looking at where the system has moved to now and the structural changes, do we have the right mechanisms in place to ensure a really coordinated approach across what is a fairly new ecosystem?
Yeah, so the governance models that we have in place for payments, they emphasise trust, access, innovation and efficiency. And you will hear me repeat those phrases multiple times during this conversation, because those are the driving principles that have guided development in the Australian payment system for 2 decades now. And that's allowed the industry to adapt as an ecosystem as new players have come in, as new capabilities have come in. It was important for us as a country to review the regulatory frameworks that supported those governance frameworks around to support innovation and access and adoption. And so, the Treasury's strategic plan sets the strategic direction, and the fact that they're going to review that every 3 to 5 years is going to help maintain that alignment as we move ahead. But things like the extension of the RBA's powers under the Payment System and Regulation Act, that's important for the RBA's remit for stability and efficiency in the payment system. The proposed payment service provider licensing framework is also important for those consistent and appropriate regulation of payment service providers. Although it will be important for that to be simple, clear, and proportionate to the risk that the PSPs are bringing to the system. And then, Katrina's already mentioned about, that coordination, that actually the industry and the regulators are pretty good at working together, at working out what is collaboration, what is cooperation, what is competition, and making sure that we maintain that competition space.
Yeah, I think those there are a lot of challenges there. There's a lot of opportunities. And bringing it back as a finance lawyer, I always like to think of things in economic terms. And looking at, all of these changes come with a cost. And it's a cost that needs to be considered, and a cost that ultimately needs to be borne by one or more participants in the system. And at least the way we see it, we're at a bit of an inflection point in terms of the evolution of the payment system from an economic perspective. A lot of new entrants coming in, often traditionally relying on the banks to fund particularly large infrastructure upgrades to enable some of these new technologies to take place. And you're seeing new entrants come in, and digital wallets is a good example of this. They're coming in and they're often leveraging off the rails of the work and the funding that's been put in by the larger players in the system. And if we look at some of the commentary around this, the RBA itself has acknowledged this as a challenge and really a particular imbalance at the moment, noting that prominent payment systems like MasterCard, Visa, and the new payments platform, they're critical infrastructure, but non-bank players are in many ways benefiting from them without necessarily the equivalent regulatory position imposed on them or associated financial obligations as well. So maybe for Dianne and Bronwyn, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. Are we in a sustainable place in terms of the development of the payment system in Australia when it comes to really distributing that value and cost across the system?
So in short, if we continue the way that we have, we're not sustainable. But I think we're beginning to see the onset of greater cross-industry within sector type dialogue. And for example, the scam prevention framework, where we're really taking a whole of ecosystem consideration, because it's not just the banks. Yes, banking plays a huge role, but to your point, tech players, platforms, telco, social media platforms, which the framework is encompassing, is really the beginning of how we're approaching things in a holistic manner to then re-examine how do we actually attribute value, risk, cost, and liability that comes with the roles that every component of that value chain plays. So I think if we continue on this type of coordinated, deliberate dialogue that is driving both within sector but cross-sector conversation, we are moving towards the direction of having a sustainable future. But the way that we have been will not give us the right outcome into the future. And that's a very important point, that we have to start those conversations now.
Dianne, what are your thoughts? Do you think we need to have a bit of a rethink about how we apportion costs?
Well, we shouldn't shy away from conversations about sustainability in payment systems, and I think the cash distribution conversations have shown how important those conversations can be. The ability to identify and address risks across the system, and in a consistent, sustainable and fair way, have those conversations, and then to reevaluate the system as it evolves, that's just part of good governance. So we shouldn't shy away from that. because sustainability changes over the long term, and it can be about, as Bronwyn said, it can be about value and cost, or volume and longevity, or even about a particular characteristic of use. And the RBA's consultation on review of merchant card payment costs and surcharging, published last week, is an example of that. In it, the RBA is recommending changes that simplify the system for merchants while giving customers a clearer, more consistent experience, and changes that help reduce costs for consumers and businesses while also increasing transparency. Those changes are always welcome. But equally, we want to ensure that we continue supporting a safe, secure, and simple payments environment. And so, we look forward to the ongoing conversation over the coming weeks as we work together to deliver what will be the best outcomes for Australian consumers and businesses.
And I think it is a constant challenge and attention that we're going to have as well, because you do have different players who, are contributing different things. As an industry, we recognise there is the need to continue to invest in things like fraud and scam prevention and cybersecurity and other areas. And sort of how do you ensure that I think also our regulatory framework is in line with the role that different organisations can play, and therefore what they pay as well. And maybe things are a little out of sync at the moment. But I think it's going to be a constant conversation that we need to face into and think about what's right for Australia.
Katrina, AP Plus, obviously an infrastructure operator. How do you make sure that public interest outcomes, such as access, security and reliability, remain central to the discussion? And again, importantly, how's it going to be paid for?
By the banks.
Yeah.
I think it's as a member-owned organisation, I think some of those public interest aspects and principles are really kind of ingrained in how we operate and what we do. So we are a member-owned organisation. Our intention is to operate payments infrastructure for the public good. We need to make sure that, we are thinking about reliability and safety. We're thinking about access. How do we create a kind of level playing field from an infrastructure perspective? I think from a funding perspective, we operate to be economically self-sustaining. So that's basically, what our objective is. We need to have money that we can continue to invest in future capabilities, because that's important from a payment infrastructure perspective, particularly to maintain things around, ensuring operational performance and resilience and cybersecurity and how we think about the core infrastructure. But ultimately, it's on a kind of user pays basis. It's thinking about, how do we spread those costs, across all of the different players, whether that's banks, whether that's a PSP, or whoever it might be in the ecosystem. And it's, I think, constantly evaluating what are those costs and thinking about how do we need to change that from a kind of wholesale scheme perspective, because that will evolve over time as well. And where we start is not necessarily where we're going to end up.
So maybe changing tack now away from the cost of things that maybe or maybe not will be paid by the banks, but that's your comment, not mine.
That's because they own us, so largely. A couple of other organisations.
Looking at, I guess, questions around sovereignty, capability, strategic risk. We're in a global payments environment. Much of our infrastructure that we have relies upon global technology and scheme providers. So we look back to the AusPay Summit earlier this year, Brad Jones from the RBA remarked that we're entering into a new era for operational risk, a result of rising geopolitical tension and other sources of potential disruption that include third-party vendors. For these reasons, strengthening resilience in our payment system and our financial market infrastructure is a key area of focus. And where innovation promises to not only enhance efficiency, but also resilience and safety in our financial system, well, all the better. So maybe, again, sticking with you, Katrina, what does domestic capability look like in that context? And are there critical functions we must either retain or build onshore here?
I think when we think about from a domestic payments perspective, that was really one of the fundamental reasons why Australian Payments Plus was created, because, we had 3 payments organisations. We had FPOS, the debit card scheme, we had BPay for bill payment, and MPP Australia from the MPP perspective. And it was actually to create a stronger domestic payments organisation to bring together all of those capabilities to, as an industry, be able to say what is important when we think about what the future roadmap needs to be, where do we want to invest as an industry, and not having some kind of, organisations pulling in different directions, but also to really build that capability within Australia. And I think one of the sort of success stories that's come from that has probably been, I think, our Connect ID scheme, in terms of we were actually able to bring together 2 different schemes that were currently being built to create, basically a very strong offering here in Australia that will provide digital identity to many Australians. And I think it's about, as a market, what are the important capabilities that we need to have? How do we ensure that we are investing in things like payee validation? How are we investing in cyber security, and doing that domestically as well, so that we have some control over our own destiny as well. And I think increasingly, different countries are recognising the importance of that as well. I think particularly when we think about, what really needs to happen onshore, I think, kind of data is probably ultimately the most important one. And that was all sort of one of the really sort of founding kind of objectives of the MPP as well, was about everything needs to basically stay within Australia. We need to think about, how we can contain that as well. And so that was very important. I think increasingly how we think about data, how that gets used, how that gets stored, how we encrypt it, how we protect it, is going to become increasingly important. I mean, we're living in a world of constant data breaches that seem to happen about every week now, unfortunately. And that's just going to become such a more important area of focus. And we need to think about, what does that mean from a context, a payments context as well? And how do we ensure that we've got the right protections in place? And how are we future-proofing for that as well?
So definitely, it gives rise to questions around resilience, and maybe for Dianne, to have a think about and share your thoughts on what sovereign capability looks like for a country like Australia.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful about the extent to which we say payments infrastructure relies on global schemes and platforms. Because if you look at the RBA's retail payment statistics, that shows, and has shown for quite a number of years now, that cards represent the greatest number of retail payments, but there's a mix in that. It's not just the global scheme. So it's whether that's device present or not present, whether it's contactless or mobile wallet, whether it's local or global card schemes. The debit cards are by far the most frequently used payment method, particularly in the retail space. But the data also shows the importance of account-to-account payments. So there's sustained growth month on month, year on year for MPP. But even things like the high-value clearing system, that has considerable value flowing through it. And the old bulk electronic system, BEX, still represents a considerable portion of volume, particularly of those business payments. So while there is a focus on resilience and strategic autonomy on our payment systems, in payments the things that matter are trust, accessibility, innovation and efficiency. And things like safety and reliability and resilience feed into those 4 principles. So while global technology providers play a role, Australia maintains a significant domestic payment infrastructure, and that helps to ensure sovereignty and system relevance.
Sure. So I think we've just had a whole session before this one on regulation, but I don't think you can get a law firm partner chairing a session and not shift the conversation at least to some point towards regulation. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And just to set the scene here, we've got an increasing use of overlay services, so such as mobile wallets, P2P payment apps, and with that has come increased layers of complexity in both accountability and consumer protection. And while the services offer convenience and innovation for consumers, they also blur traditional lines of responsibility. What happens when it goes wrong? Now these services, the overlay services, as they suggest, often sit on top of existing payment rails, thinking here Visa, MasterCard, the NPP, but they're not always subject, as we've touched on earlier, to the same regulatory considerations as banks or traditional participants in the market. So that creates clearly potential gaps in things like dispute resolution, fraud liability, service reliability and transparency, quite a key topic at the moment. If we look at it a little bit further from a global payments regulation perspective, ensuring, again, transparency, accountability, consumer protection across multi-provider payment chains is clearly a growing priority for people. And as payments increasingly involve multiple intermediaries, banks, fintechs, wallets, global schemes, regulators worldwide are implementing frameworks, hopefully consistently, to clarify responsibilities and protect users of the system. So maybe for Bronwyn, if we could start with you, in the context of the upcoming PSRA regs, how should regulators think about the tension between competition, innovation and resilience in payments?
Sure. So I think Katrina touched on that earlier. The first starting point would be for the regulators to think about what areas do we want to drive collaboration. And so how do they then think about the design of the regulation and the code in the way that supports that collaboration across the ecosystem? And what are the areas that they want to be driving for competition? And so what are the elements of that they need to work into the consideration of that design? But from the collaborative front to the competitor front, it is also very important because of the various players that are now in the ecosystem, unlike the traditional players of banks previously. It's also important to map out kind of the risk that each of those parties are now bringing to that payment flow. So whether that's the party that provides the instruction to authorization, to clearing, to settlement, all of that brings about slightly different risks. So there are new risks that are being introduced along that value chain, of which then the regulators need to be quite cognizant of because it cannot be a one-size-fits-all regulation or regime. But overall, the key thing is about everyone should be subject to the same regulation. Because the last thing we want is create any unintended consequences whereby one part of the ecosystem is regulated versus another part of the ecosystem that is not. Because that's usually where the weakest link will exist or vulnerability will exist for bad actors to actually infiltrate into the ecosystem. But with that though, whilst everyone should be regulated the same way, it is more about the intensity of that oversight, the proportionality of where the risk lie that needs to be more thought through in terms of the various players that are now part of the ecosystem. So there's a lot of multiple layers that I think regulators need to think through as they work through what PSRA look like in the upcoming dialogue that I'm sure we're all very looking forward to having.
I know I am. Katrina, maybe, we're lucky in Australia. We have obviously a very strong regulatory environment, but we've also got a very strong industry environment as well in terms of participation and involvement in driving regulation, quasi-regulation per se in the space. Where do you think we should draw the line between the two?
I mean, I think, and I think Dianne touched on this, in terms of, I think there is a very good relationship between industry and the regulators here in Australia, and I think we've certainly demonstrated what can be done through the power of collaboration from an industry perspective, looking at things like industry coming together to build and develop the new payments platform and deliver that capability to the market. I think what the regulator really needs to kind of step in and the role that they play is about what effectively are the kind of guardrails that need to be put in place that we then operate within and kind of things like the licensing regime that we're all operating in and making sure that's fit for purpose, particularly as Bronwyn touches on it, the world has now changed and moved on. Is really, really important, I think, in terms of that's where they need to really kind of, put that in place for us. But I think ultimately it's about having a very strong working relationship as well on an ongoing basis, I think, in terms of having, the flow of information and kind of really bringing both sides together, in terms of will get us to the best outcomes. And I think we've seen that in the past, again, touching on the MPP where, the regulator was very heavily involved in that whole journey in terms of, right from the beginning and still continues to be to this day. But, sometimes, we need to make sure that we've got that right kind of sort of regulatory framework in place as well and that it's evolving in line with what's happening from an industry perspective as well.
So we've got about 7 minutes left. I think we're going to try and do a bit of a look forward now, and I definitely don't want to delay anyone getting to afternoon tea. I don't want to be that person in the room. You can feel the death stares when that happens. So really, sorry.
At least it's not drinks.
It is. I had that once. That was terrible. But look, I think it's quite clear it's a big year again for payments in Australia. It's a big year for regulatory development and reform. I guess with the need to balance innovation with measured regulation that reduces the risk of regulatory arbitrage, as well as an increased focus on resilience with our critical infrastructure, it really is time to look forward. And I'd be interested for each of your views in terms of what you would see as a safe, sustainable and innovative ecosystem. What would that look like in 2030? And are we heading in the right direction to get there?
I think we're heading in the right direction, but probably not fast enough. And I think in some of the other discussion today is about, the rise of AI, quantum computing. That's just going to create more change, more disruption in a much more rapid pace. So I think it is about being able to, and that rapid pace change is going to be for the good guys and the bad guys. So it is very important that we need to continue to have very actionable dialogue as an industry with the regulator, so that we are not just about having the conversation, but having plans in place to actually do something to move towards a very sustainable, strong future for Australia. So what would be great in 2030 is where Australia continues to be an extremely attractive market for domestic or international businesses, big and small, to want to come in and create awesome innovation, drive really exciting payment experiences, because our consumers will continue to have the trust in the ecosystem so that they know that they are protected and that they want to try new things. But at the same time, we need to be strong enough in our regulation to deter all the bad guys to be preying on Australian consumers and businesses. So I think that's what a good 2030 would look like with some of the actions and plans in place.
What are your thoughts, Dianne?
I think a safe, sustainable, innovative payment system will continue to help our customers pay for things. We might make and receive payments in different ways than we do today. They might be being made by agents, with agentic payments. Those are things that we're already talking about. We know that post-2030, digitally native payments will make up the majority of payment transactions in Australia. And so that's what our system has to be ready for, and to have the space to allow the choice competition to enable that to happen. I'll come back to, though, the thing that won't change will be trust, access, innovation, efficiency, because those are core to the way that payment networks, payment systems work and what customers expect of payments. We want it to be simple, embedded, trusted.
I think we're definitely on the right path. I think we've started that journey. I think there is still some work to be done to really define what is the kind of end state that we're all working towards. What actually does, sort of safety mean to me versus Dianne versus Bronwyn? What does resilience mean? What's important from a security perspective? And so that's why actually at the moment we're in the midst of a public consultation to actually define for account-to-account payments. What do we want that future to look like in Australia? What's really important? What's really important from an end user perspective as well, and to anchor back on some of the public interest perspectives when we think about access and competition, when we think about, fraud and safety as well. I think certainly we have all of the ingredients here in Australia to continue to build on what is a world-class payments infrastructure, I think, and to really capitalise on that opportunity and think about, from an economy perspective, how do we unlock some of that value as well? And when we think about, what does the payment system need to do, when we think about productivity, efficiency, innovation, and what's going to be important over the longer term.
Okay, so maybe to wrap it up, you get one wish. And what is the most important thing, or the most important change you would like to see going forward?
Can I have two?
Yes.
So I think certainly the licensing reforms that I think we've been talking about for a little while, actually seeing that materialise, because I think it's really important to ensure that that's fit for purpose as well for the future when we think about our payment system. And then my other wish, I think, is really as we think about that payments modernisation journey, how do we all move a bit faster? How do we all actually kind of work together to really agree on what it is that future that we're trying to build, and what does that look like, and do that together?
I hope that we prioritise simple, embedded payment experiences that meet customer needs, customers at the centre of what we're doing.
Bronwyn, you get two.
Well,
if you like.
I hope that regulator and all industry participants can actually align on the objectives so that we're removing duplication and contradiction, as we heard this morning about some regulations are actually contradictory, and really spending the time to work on identifying the synergies that we can create with the national assets that we've got.
Brilliant. I think we're at time, so if you could join me in thanking each of the panellists, Katrina, Dianne and Bronwyn. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And brought in ahead of schedule. Well played, James. Thank you so much, Bronwyn, Dianne and Katrina. Bronwyn mentioned quantum tomorrow, 10 a.m. We've got a fascinating conversation, including Kathy Foley, the former Chief Scientist of Australia, on quantum and its implications for the sector. In a couple of seconds, we are going to break for afternoon tea. We're going to throw a little QR code up here, however, right now. We're going to take a couple of minutes to quickly fill out our delegate survey for the entire day. This is a crucial avenue of feedback for conference organisers to continue to deliver events that are of maximum relevance for you all. Last year, you might recall we had feedback after every individual session, and if we got one consistent piece of feedback about the feedback was we spent too much time asking for feedback. So this year we changed things up a little bit. Can we throw up that QR code there on the screen? Thank you. If you have any trouble understanding how it all works, see the ABA crew for directions. But let's just take a couple of seconds now. I'm just going to keep talking until I see that QR code flashing up on the screen, then give you a couple of minutes to fill out the... I'll certainly be giving some feedback on the QR code. Have we got the QR code there at the back of the room there, guys? We don't have it. Excellent. We're going to get your thoughts tomorrow on today's performances. So keep them. If there's anything you can remember tomorrow, we must have absolutely crushed it. Okay. What does happen after afternoon tea? First of all, please take everything with you now because we're going to strike all the tables here and set up for the dinner this evening. We're moving to our breakout sessions after our half-hour afternoon tea. They start at 4:05 p.m. They're all on this level, just around the corner. You can go to the conference app to book your sessions if you want. There is a 5-minute changeover, so you can move between rooms if you like the first offering in one room and the second offering in the other and the like. But let's break now for afternoon tea. See you back here for dinner this evening. Your breakout sessions start in about half an hour.